prehistoric time hole no one can explain. For a species as curious, expressive, and restless as we are today, you'd expect our ancestors to have always been, well, loud. But here's where it gets weird. Homo sapiens, which is modern humans, have existed for at least 200,000 years. Not almost humans, though, but actual people with the same bodies and brains. But for the first 150,000 years, they did almost nothing that looked like us. There were no cave paintings, gods, or graves. It was just stone tools, firewood, and survival, over and over again. Then out of nowhere, something changes. By 50,000 years ago, we start to find signs of imagination bursting into life. There was art on cave walls, beads strung into necklaces, and burials with meaning. Even people sailing into the unknown, chasing lands they couldn't even see. So what happened? Why the silence? What were we doing for all that time? And why did culture, creativity, and symbolic thought suddenly ignite like a wildfire after tens of thousands of years of stillness? This strange gap, the one between our physical evolution and our cultural awakening, is what some call a prehistoric time hole. And the more we dig into it, the clearer it becomes. The answer isn't simple. It's not one thing. It's a web of discoveries spanning continents, genes, long-lost cousins, and ancient math. In this story, we're going back to the silence before the story, and we'll uncover how humanity didn't evolve in a straight line, but in whispers, setbacks, side quests, and slow-burning brilliance. When researchers first tried to make sense of the long silence in human history, they went looking for a single answer, one cause and moment, one magical switch that turned us into artists, musicians, and storytellers. And for a while, they thought they'd found it in our DNA. The theory was simple and dramatic. Sometime around 50,000 years ago, a powerful mutation rewired the human brain. It was like downloading the upgrade that unlocked creativity, language, and symbolic thought all at once. According to this view, we weren't lacking the ability to express ourselves. We were waiting for the right genetic spark. That spark had a name, FOXP2. Discovered in the 1990s, FOXP2 was first linked to families that had severe speech and language disorders. People with mutations in this gene struggled to form words or speak clearly. Scientists quickly realized FOXP2 wasn't just another gene. It played a central role in communication. Even more fascinating, it wasn't acting alone. FOXP2 controlled the activity of dozens of other genes tied to brain development. You can see why people got excited. For a moment, it looked like this was the answer to the prehistoric mystery. FOXP2 became known as the language gene, the missing piece that might explain why culture suddenly bloomed after so many quiet years. Maybe we simply couldn't think symbolically before that mutation. Maybe we couldn't even speak. But then everything changed. In 2007, a team of researchers made a surprising discovery. They sequenced the FOXP2 gene in Neanderthals, our long-extinct cousins, and found something no one expected. Neanderthals had the same version of the gene as modern humans. That was a problem, a big one. If FOXP2 was responsible for triggering symbolic thought and complex speech, then Neanderthals shouldn't have had it. After all, the theory was that this gene made us special. And yet, there it was, hiding in their DNA. The same code, the same potential. Suddenly, the idea of a single gene being the master key didn't hold up anymore. Culture, it turns out, doesn't begin with a flip of a switch. It's not just about one gene unlocking creativity. It's deeper, messier, and far more gradual than anyone had hoped. And let's be honest, this wasn't an easy pill to swallow. The one mutation theory was neat. It gave us a satisfying story with a clear before and after. But nature rarely works that way. Evolution doesn't write in straight lines. It prefers slow buildup, strange detours, and long waits. FOXP2 was important, yes, but it wasn't the magic button people had imagined. In fact, if Neanderthals had FOXP2, then the capacity for speech and symbolic thought might go back even farther than we thought. Which means we weren't the only ones capable of thinking deeply or dreaming out loud. So if a gene didn't do it, what did? If culture didn't explode because of one sudden mutation, then how do we explain the delayed rise of cave paintings, jewelry, and music? Well, once the FOXP2 theory started to crack, scientists began digging deeper, literally. And what they found buried in caves and cliff shelters across Africa would change everything we thought we knew about early human creativity. Let's look at what the archaeological record has to say and why the signs of culture may have been hiding right under our noses. Once the idea of a single brain mutation started to fall apart, scientists did what good scientists always do. They went back to the evidence. And that's when things got interesting, because while everyone had been staring at Europe, waiting for the story of humanity to begin, some of the oldest signs of symbolic behavior were quietly turning up somewhere else, deep in the caves and coastlines of Africa. Let's start with a place called Blombos Cave, located on the southern tip of South Africa. There, archaeologists uncovered something small but extraordinary: pieces of red ochre, a type of iron-rich pigment, carved with deliberate abstract patterns. Some of the engravings resembled cross-hatching and geometric lines. Nothing random about them. The age? Roughly 100,000 years old. Think about that. People were etching symbols onto stone more than 50,000 years before the so-called cultural explosion. That's not survival behavior. That's something else. That's an expression. But Blombos didn't stop there. Nearby, researchers found tiny shell beads, each one with a perfectly drilled hole. These weren't scraps or tools. They were ornaments and personal decoration. Maybe even early forms of status symbols or identity. It's jewelry, plain and simple. And again, it's old. Really old. Still not convinced? Let's head over to Pinnacle Point, another site along the same coast. Here, humans were using fire to treat stone, improving the quality of their tools. Not only that, they were harvesting shellfish, which means they understood tides, seasonality, and coastal ecosystems. That's advanced planning. That's knowing how to work with your environment instead of just reacting to it. And here's the kicker. These layers date back as far as 164,000 years ago. So while we once thought art, technology, and symbolism appeared overnight, the truth is they've been simmering in the background for tens of thousands of years. It wasn't a sudden spark, it was a slow, steady build. We also have clues from Cebu Cave and other nearby shelters. Archaeologists have found signs of painted ostrich eggshells, likely used as decorated water containers. They've uncovered traces of early bedding, composite tools made from multiple materials, think glue, pistone, and continued use of red ochre. These discoveries tell a very different story from the old narrative. They show people who were thinking ahead, organizing their space, planning their lives, and attaching meaning to the objects they made. These weren't just survivalists. They were creators, designers, and maybe even storytellers. The old idea that behavioral modernity began around 50,000 years ago, it's outdated. That moment wasn't the beginning. It was the tipping point, the moment when all those scattered sparks finally came together and caught fire. But here's the twist. These early signs were always there. We just didn't know how to read them. Why? Because for a long time, researchers were looking in the wrong places or maybe asking the wrong questions. Which brings us to another big reason this mystery went unnoticed for so long: where we were digging. So if all these early signs of culture were hiding in Africa, why did it take so long for us to notice them? The short answer: we weren't looking. For a long time, archaeology as a field was deeply focused on Europe. That's where the big institutions were. That's where the money was. That's where the researchers lived. So it's no surprise that the earliest and most publicized discoveries came from caves in France and Spain. Places like Lascaux, where the walls are covered in breathtaking animal paintings, or Germany, where sculpted figurines were found. But here's the catch. Homo sapiens didn't even arrive in Europe until about 50,000 years ago, which means all those famous discoveries, the cave art, the bone flutes, the carved lions, can only be as old as that. And yet, because those were the first pieces of symbolic behavior we found, we built an entire theory around them. A whole narrative that said, this is when culture began. But that's kind of like saying a band only exists the day they drop their first hit single. It ignores the years they spent rehearsing in garages and playing to empty bars. In reality, the roots of human culture were already deep in the ground, just not in Europe. Once researchers began widening their lens, they started uncovering evidence from Africa, Asia, and beyond. And what they found completely reshaped the timeline. Symbols, tools, and ornaments. Many of them tens of thousands of years older than anything in Europe. But those discoveries came later, often from smaller teams with fewer resources, and they didn't always make the headlines. So the old Eurocentric story stuck around far longer than it should have. This isn't unique to archaeology. You see it in medicine, in psychology, in history. The parts of the world that get the most attention often end up defining the story for everyone else. But science has grown up. Today we know better. We know the human story didn't begin in Europe, it migrated there. The cave paintings in France, they weren't the spark. They were the echo of something much older, something already in motion. And once you accept that, the entire mystery starts to shift. Because the idea that Homo sapiens suddenly became modern at 50,000 years ago, that's not the full story. To really understand what happened, we need to zoom out. Because Homo sapiens weren't the only ones on the scene. Now let's explore the other humans we shared the Earth with, and how they may have shaped the culture we thought was ours alone. We like to think we're special, that Homo sapiens were the main characters all along. Smarter, sharper, more creative than anything that came before or after. But that story, it's a little too neat. Because the truth is, we weren't alone. For most of our history, we shared the planet with other humans. Not animals, not apes, other species of humans, each with their own lives, their own tools, their own cultures. And the more we learn about them, the harder it becomes to claim the spotlight for ourselves. Let's start with the most famous of the bunch, Neanderthals. They first appeared around 400,000 years ago and spread across Europe and parts of Western Asia. For over a century, they were painted as primitive brutes, hunched, hairy, grunting in caves. But that image couldn't be more wrong. Neanderthals were intelligent and adaptive. They made sophisticated stone tools tailored to specific uses, like hunting, cutting, or scraping. They knew how to control fire, and there's even evidence they used manganese dioxide, a black powder, to help ignite wood more efficiently. That's not just survival, that's chemistry. They may have been spiritual too. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found Neanderthal skeletons carefully placed in shallow graves, some possibly sprinkled with flower pollen. Was it ritual, mourning, respect for the dead? We don't know for sure, but it hints at something deeply human. And then there's the artwork. In a Spanish cave called La Pasiega, red pigment markings have been dated to over 64,000 years ago, thousands of years before Homo sapiens even arrived in Europe. The artists? Neanderthals. Even more mind-blowing? In Bruniquel Cave, France, deep underground, researchers discovered ring-shaped structures made from broken stalagmites carefully arranged in pitch darkness, more than 300 meters from the entrance. These structures date back around 176,000 years. That kind of planning and effort doesn't come from instinct. It comes from imagination. Clearly, Neanderthals weren't the lumbering half-cousins we once thought. They were thinkers, creators, maybe even dreamers. But they weren't alone either. In 2010, a team analyzing DNA from a tiny pinky bone found in a Siberian cave made a startling discovery. The bone didn't match Neanderthal DNA or ours. It came from an entirely new human species, the Denisovans. We don't know much about what Denisovans looked like. We've never found a full skeleton, but we know they were genetically distinct and that they left their mark. Today, many people in Melanesia and Australia carry up to 4% Denisovan DNA. That means they didn't just exist, they interbred with us. And they had style too. In the same cave, archaeologists found a polished green bracelet made from a rare stone called chlorite. It had a drilled hole, possibly made with a rotating tool, and it gleamed like something you'd find in a museum gift shop. The bracelet is estimated to be 40,000 years old or older, and it wasn't made by Homo sapiens. That kind of craftsmanship takes skill, patience, and care. It's jewelry, but more than that, it's identity, it's culture. Now, let's go back even further to the species that paved the way for all of us. Homo erectus first appeared almost 2 million years ago, and they stuck around for a stunningly long time until about 100,000 years ago. They were the first humans to leave Africa, the first to use fire regularly, and likely the first to cook food. And that changed everything. Cooking made food easier to digest and more calorie-rich, which probably helped fuel larger brains. But Homo erectus wasn't just practical, they were expressive too. In 2014, researchers in Java found a freshwater shell with a precise zigzag engraving on it. The age? roughly 500,000 years old. That's the oldest known abstract carving by any human ancestor. It may not look like much, but it tells us this. Someone sat down and made those marks on purpose. Not for survival, but for meaning. Even with smaller brains, some human species were doing surprisingly complex things. Take Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa's Rising Star cave system. Their brains were no bigger than oranges, and yet they may have been deliberately burying their dead over 200,000 years ago. That kind of behavior suggests a sense of self, memory, or even ritual, despite having none of the intelligence upgrades we tend to brag about. And then there's Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit. These tiny humans stood about 3 feet tall and lived on the Indonesian island of Flores. They may have gone extinct only 50,000 years ago, right around the time Homo sapiens arrived. They made tools, hunted, and adapted to an isolated island environment, thriving in their own unique way. All of these species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Erectus, Naledi, Floresiensis, existed alongside early Homo sapiens. Sometimes we fought, sometimes we ignored each other. Sometimes we even made babies together. So maybe the real story isn't that Homo sapiens invented culture. Maybe we just inherited it from a sprawling, experimental family tree of humans, each one trying, creating, and evolving in their own corner of the world. We weren't the only thinkers. We weren't the only storytellers. We were just the ones who made it through. Next is the old idea of human evolution as a ladder, and why it's time to start thinking in branches instead. When you hear that human culture suddenly exploded around 50,000 years ago, it sounds like something magical must have happened, some brilliant flash of insight, some epic turning point. But that's not how it went down. There was no single spark, no overnight revelation. What really happened was kindling, a slow, quiet buildup of people, patterns, and possibilities until the flame finally caught. By this time, the climate had begun to settle. After long cycles of unpredictability, certain parts of the world, especially along rivers, coastlines, and fertile valleys, became more stable. And stability meant people could stay put longer, build relationships, form memories, and plan for more than just the next meal. With these better conditions, populations grew. Groups started clustering around natural resources, crossing paths more often, and forming networks. People weren't just surviving anymore, they were connecting. Ideas could now travel, skills could spread, memories could be passed from one generation to the next without vanishing. That's when culture started to move differently, not just in isolated sparks, but as a growing snowball, one that finally had enough people, time, and memory to keep rolling. With that momentum, the changes came fast. Cave art in hidden chambers, lit by torchlight, carvings and jewelry, worn for meaning, status, or beauty, myths and spirits passed down as whispers in the dark, burials with care, maybe even grief, maybe even love. And yes, boats, launched into open water, chasing islands no one could see. This wasn't just the beginning of creativity, this was the beginning of continuity. We'd had the brains all along. What we needed was the bandwidth, the memory space, the people, the stories stacked high enough to build something lasting. Once that system clicked into place, human culture didn't just survive, it took off. For a long time, we thought Homo sapiens were the ones who lit the fire of humanity. But now we know better. We didn't invent humanity, rather we inherited it. The capacity to wonder, to decorate, to dream out loud, that wasn't exclusive to us. It flickered in the hands of Neanderthals painting in Spanish caves. It echoed in the chipped bracelet left behind by a Denisovan. It shimmered in the zigzag etched by Homo erectus 500,000 years ago. We weren't the first to think. We were just the ones who held on long enough to pass it down. What we once called a prehistoric time hole wasn't a void at all. It was a slow accumulation, a layering of sparks that never quite went out. For tens of thousands of years, those sparks glowed quietly in hidden corners of the world. And when the conditions finally lined up, when enough people gathered, stayed, and remembered, the fire caught. And it changed everything. From that moment, we began painting stars on cave ceilings. We began burying our dead with meaning. We crossed oceans we couldn't see across. We dreamed, we worshipped, we wrote ourselves into the world. Not because we were newly smart, but because we were finally connected enough to share what we already had inside us. It's not just about where we came from, it's about where we're still going. Because the big question was never just what happened back then. The real question might be, what are we still becoming? We are still evolving, still imagining, still shaping the future from the tools of the past. And somewhere in our DNA, we carry the voices of those early humans, those cousins, those ancestors, those other branches of the tree who dreamed before us. So let the mystery stay alive, because sometimes the best way to move forward is to understand what caught fire in the first place.